Hello, everyone. Hi, 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 hi. My name is Keng Sen. Thank you for coming for today. And, today is the beginning of a 3-week season that we will have called the Curator's Suitcase. And for those of you who know a little bit about it, the Curator's Suitcase is a new project that began because last year our Young Curators Academy was fully digitized. So it's fully digitalized, and we felt a little bit that perhaps if there was a chance, we would want to do some live program around it. And there was a chance, there is a chance now, and of course, it's nice to have these 7, 8 curators coming over the next 3 weeks. Each of them will spend some time here in the studio, and some of them are already in the house. Um, this program began as the Academy in Herb Salon in 2019 when it was completely live. And at that time, we had about 30 or 31 curators, young curators. And this time last year, because it's once in 2 years we do it, and last year we had about 17 curators, and they joined myself and Erdan Kosova, I don't know whether he's here, and Zilke Barker, the three of us. Zilke is here, I know she's here somewhere. The three of us were the mentors for about 17 young curators, and there was 17, but the open call was about 170 people applied, and then we chose about 10%. And I think that first of all, I should say that we have a very expanded notion of the curator and what curation is, because, of course, for those of you who know Gorky, which you have been here very often, Gorky is very much about art and politics. And so our definition of the curator is not somebody who is an institutional curator, not somebody who's an institutional programmer, but somebody who is perhaps at a crossing between art and activism. And this means that we are looking at this expanded notion of the curator as the activator of a community or of several communities, where the curator could be an artist, could be a writer, could be a political activist, could be a, a real curator, it could be a producer, it could be somebody who's working more as perhaps in NGOs, perhaps. So we have a very expanded vision of the curator as the activator of communities. And this is because I suppose we do hope that we see curators as change makers, so that they have a role not just in making their own work, but a role in terms of having a dialogue and in terms of having a space to transform or to change the worlds which they are working in. So perhaps it's a good time to start, and we'll put on the first slide. Okay, so I was, um, when I started this talk, I felt like perhaps we should work on this idea of the title itself, right? Curating as world creating. And I have two other options of titles. And as so we try to break apart what each of these English words are doing. I mean, curating, I've just talked about this expanded notion of curating. And this what we call in English the conjunction. Is it curating as, curating and, curating followed by brackets perhaps? So this idea of curating as world creating. And of course, as we started to get deeper into this material, you suddenly realize that there's some technical terms that academics are using about world something, right? That means world creating, worlding, world building, which comes more from science fiction spaces. Um, so it could be curating as world building, it could be curating as worlding, it could be curating and worlding, it could be curating bracket worlding. So so this is one option of the title, and I have a kind of quote here, which is from John Luke Nancy, and you know he, I would say, comes from the line of philosophers who would be more in the Heidegger line, right? That means that looking at this idea of being in the world in a way which is very much about economy, about globalization, maybe I would say like probably the Marxist viewpoint. And I felt that his quote here is important because it does start to bring us to the meaning of words, right? Which, and as some of you know, that Delane is having an exhibition here, and it's called "Beware of Linguistic Engineering." So this whole thing about the meaning of words, and his quote here: "We must ask anew what the world wants of us, and what we want of it, without the capital of the world, but with the richness of the world." So this idea that richness is different from capital, of course, and the sense that we're going to come up against this whole uh, sense of capitalism and how we have arrived at the twilight, perhaps, of capitalism as we go into a different phase, which of course has been very much triggered by the pandemic, where the world was kind of leveled, where across the whole world there were travel restrictions, and I think that this sense of beginning with a kind of um, I would say a white male philosopher, although it doesn't necessarily mean that white male philosophers remain as white male philosophers, because there are many ideas which are not necessarily white and not necessarily male. So, but this first line I wanted to put forward this sense of the kind of capital and economics and Marxism. Although you can see that in Nancy's words, it's probably he's already going beyond. He's going into some space of the richness of the world, which is not about capital per se. And then I wanted to then quickly introduce in the first 5 slides as a kind of a kind of a theoretical basis of it, and so starting with this white male position, and then rewriting the white male perspective, and the white male perspective is based on being in the world, but what do we actually mean by the world, right? So in the Heidegger line and also a little bit Nancy's line is being in a specific history, of course, a history of from the West and from the first world, is being in a specific history of globalization. And then you have two other writers, Donna Haraway, for example. She talks about worlding, referring to the cooperative and conflictual ways of world making in which different species, technologies, and forms of knowledge interact. Right, so you already begin to get into the space of the non-human species, right? You get into the space of a situation of the post-humans, of artificial intelligence, and she opens up this space for us, Miss Haraway, and of course also Gayatri Spivak, who, as she says, deliberately vulgarizing Heidegger. She has said before, she understood worlding as the imposition of order and control on a foreign territory, right? The idea that, and so she brings in a colonial perspective and a kind of a post-colonial position, and that worlding is a specific order to order the chaos of either the natural world or to order the chaos of a world which colonials don't understand, right? So I think this is very important as a kind of as a way to bring us into the specific words of worlding and all this world creating, world building, etc., etc. And the next part is I want to stay a little bit with Haraway, or staying with trouble. This is her 2016 book, and as she claims, SF science fiction or speculative fabulation is one definition of worlding, right? And I think it's very interesting that, in a way, the word fiction is rejected because it's really talking about, as she says, SF is storytelling and fact telling. Fact telling is not fiction telling, fact telling. It is the patterning of possible worlds and possible times, material, semiotic worlds, gone, here, and yet to come. So you already see this fantastic, always this opening up which Haraway provides, where she's talking about they are not fictional worlds, but they are possible worlds, and they are facts. And also, of course, that it's both material, new materialism, or it could be science, it could be semiotics. It's not necessarily real, right? But they are signs in the space. And they have come before us, and they are with us now, and they may have gone, they may have yet to come. So this idea, which I bring this point up because, here we are in Gorky theatre, and Gorky theatre is so much about narratives, and I think that this idea of SF, some people say is speculative feminisms, is about storytelling and fact-telling, right? Because there is no such thing as fiction. Everything is a fact. And and then I wanted to propose a second title, which was, as I said earlier, playing with these conjunctions and brackets, and playing with different sorts of world words, right? So this is more curating and then bracket and world building. And world building is more often used as a kind of a technical term, right? It's a term about presenting an imaginary world, a fictional universe, usually by SF writers, and they have to create the history, the geography, the ecology, the backstory, the flora, the fauna, who are the inhabitants of a future planet, what is the technology they use, what are the customs there, what is the invented languages. So there's a kind of a technical meaning of this word world building, which comes from almost like video games, SF, speculative fabulations. And it's a term which is a bit different from world creating, because world creating is not belonging to this technical SF terminology, right, of a kind of a science-fi writer who has to create this, who has to world build an imagined planet or several imagined planets and several systems of the cosmos. So this sense of world building, and I put in brackets, it means that the curator is the creator, possibly, right? And the person who constructs, who creates, rather than the conservative term of curating, which is coming from cura or care, taking care, right? That in a way the curator is not conventionally seen as the creator, but is someone who takes care, perhaps more like a dramaturg who takes care of a process and takes care of a collection. But I think that this I had quite a lot of fun this morning playing with the titles and thinking of, like, okay, how to what to title it finally. And of course, I have in the publicity we've called it world building as a kind of a nod towards this week, which is about a lot about planetary consciousness. But I felt that perhaps the better word would be worlding, right? And that this curating and worlding, where we're not saying that curating as world creating, which I think is a very it's almost a too proud a term, that perhaps it's more humble to call it curating and worlding rather than curating as world creating, right? That means that you are the God voice or something like that. And possibly this sense of this bracket and world building also creates a sense that curating is about creation. Well, I think the curating has a lot of taking care, but also a sense of the complexities, the intersectional complexities that we end up working with a lot or engaging with a lot. And I wanted to take a quote from these two ladies who are wonderful artists. They are from the field of dance and writing, Helen Palmer and Vicky Hunter, and they wrote this in 2018. And it's in a website called New Materialism. I accessed it this morning, so it's still there. It's not been taken off. I feel like that term worlding is able to contain the non-human post-human elements because they are working in that perspective. But it's it's something about worlding is informed by our turning of attention to a certain experience, our turning of attention to a place, to an encounter, and our active engagement with the materiality and the context in which these events and interactions occur. So it seems to be suggesting that worlding is very much about some kind of um, physical experience also, not just a digital experience. It could be a digital experience, but it seems that you need to be immersed in it. And I think it's very important to start to think about this as we go back into this notion of like, should we travel? Should we go by train? Should we fly? Should we not bring any artists who have to fly? It's a very important moment for us to rethink how we have done our work in the past, but at the same time, also to acknowledge that this idea of worlding, where we have to turn our attention to a certain experience, place, or encounter, is not going to be enough just with the internet, perhaps. It needs a kind of a hybrid position. It needs a very deep um, um, entrance into technology, not just the kind of technology as a tool for us to have a meeting, but somehow it's the attention which is completely focused on perhaps this technological space and time, right? So it's above all an embodied and enacted process. This is important, that it's embodied. And of course, the question is that how do we embody technology? How do we embody digital spaces? It's a way of being in the world, and so now we go back to this old chestnut that Heidegger first talked about, being in the world. But what is the world, right? And it consists of an individual's whole person act. It's an entire person's act of attending to that world. So it's not like you are just kind of like doing three computers at one time and digitally touching on these spaces, but there's some kind of almost like even though it's virtual, you've entered into that world. So I felt that this very kind of like complex definition by Helen Palmer and Vicky Hunter had this potential for us to kind of talk today of some projects which I think have spanned time, and they've also spanned being physically there as well as virtually there. For example, last year's DYCA, and the fact that now we are all gathered again, and with this complexity of like it's not all or nothing, but it's a very hybrid space, and that is a space where we have to rethink what is the world, right? Because we're at this whole moment where our human world, our decolonialities, which we've talked about so much before, is no longer perhaps sufficient. We have to talk about how we are colonizing rocks. We have to talk about how we are colonizing, of course, nature, and all these things goes beyond the Spanish colonization of South America, and of course the British Empire and German businesses in Africa, the Dutch, you know. So this whole sense of like that the colonialisms are very much expanded today, right? So just as we talked about expanded curation, we're also in a space of very complex ways of looking at these old chestnut words like colonization, decolonization, post-colonial. So this is so I want to just begin 15 years earlier with a project which I spent a lot of my young childhood doing, which is called the Flying Circus Project, which is a kind of a nomadic artist residency where we moved from country to country, and it was very much about traveling as a way of physical thinking, where when we traveled, we were involved in a process of research. So the whole question of how do we travel now that travel is back up, so to speak? How do we travel? Not so much should we travel. I think that we have to continue traveling, perhaps, but how should we be traveling? And this particular flying circus, there were several which was in different parts of Asia, but I'm focusing on the Vietnam one, partly because also of the history of Vietnam in Germany, East Germany, Berlin, the socialist history. I thought that it was a good way to segue some things together. And at that time, we had 26 artists together for 2 weeks. And of course, the whole question is that do we have to have so many artists today? And how do we think of expanded time? And how do we think about this notion of physical thinking? Where, and of course, here in Germany, we have this notion of the flaneur, right? That the sense that as you walk, as you travel, there is something happening to your both your conscious and unconscious and your subconscious. So this sense of this was really a kind of it was about a travel log with participants thinking and questioning and going to and traveling together, and this idea that we would start to become aware in a different way, right? It would not be the Vietnam War which I see in a Hollywood movie, but there is some other thing that happens to us as we are traveling and thinking together. So it of course it falls outside the frame of capitalism because it's about talking, listening, thinking, questioning, researching, kind of all useless things in a market economy, or at best it's viewed ambivalently. And it's this idea that this uh, traveling was about listening and researching, and a kind of also this politics of listening, which happens when you're actually listening to someone, not when you're listening to a cassette or a tape or a digital file. But what happens when you're in front of somebody and this person is perhaps speaking a different language, and perhaps they're also um, uh, r- relating in a world in a way where you have to constantly ask yourself, what is the relationship that you have with the speaker as you are listening to the speaker? So, despite this intense sharing of these 2 weeks where we were traveling very heavily together, the crux of the FCP is that there's a displacement of production, that nothing is produced, right? And this was very radical in 2007. We're talking about 15 years ago, where in a way this notion of production is not as challenged as now, right? Where we are really in a moment where we are asking, do we need to produce so much? Do we need to what is the what do we have to make? Because I think central to the question of most of us who are working in the arts is, what do we continue to make? Um, do we continue to make the same sort of things? Do we continue to work in the same way as curators, as programmers, as writers, as intendants? Because this whole question of can we continue to behave like how we have done in the last 10, 20 years. I found it quite interesting very recently that in Berlin there was, of course, um, Deutsch dance platform, and many people, the Goethe Institute brought a lot of people from all over the world, and they're all gathered together, and they are thinking about buying shows. So for me, I found it really kind of like, mm, can we buy shows like how we've bought shows before? Can we make shows to be bought like how we've done it before? In the sense that, do we know whether we can even travel a group of five, six people? And why bring 50 presenters from around the world to look at dance from Germany in a way where is it more like we should rethink what we are making rather than just going back to traveling and then doing things like how we've always done it before? I think that there's a big soul searching, not only by artists, but we also have to acknowledge, at least in the part of the world that I come from Asia, we have lost a lot of audiences in these last 3 years, because our theater there is not subsidized, and also in the meantime, Netflix, everybody was at home, so they don't need to even travel to go to the theater anymore. Of course, everybody misses theater when you talk to the theater audience, but in a way, in the part of the world where I come from, there is no theater audience. We are really a much more mixed kind of mixed crowd of people who are looking for discourse, looking for entertainment, looking for a good night out, looking for a good meal, looking for a good conversation, looking for theater as well. So there's a real sense that uh, in Singapore and that part of the world, that we've lost our audiences. And I think that the question of what we have to do as artists is a little bit different, for perhaps from here, or perhaps it's the same. I can't generalize, but I know that I myself, I was picking up a lot on work which uh, were cancelled and postponed. But I've not done a new show. That means a show that was not planned before the pandemic. I've not done a new show now for 3 years, and this summer I'll be directing a new show, and it took me a long time to really say yes, because I felt a little bit like, um, can we travel together? Can we look at Salome in the context of Iran, and Salome in the context of Japan, and Salome in the context of trans culture? Um, um, can we just do that by bringing everybody together, rehearsing, and then uh, finish, put the show up, tour? So it's a bit, there's a big kind of a, maybe, I wouldn't say confidence crisis, but really a rethinking of like, where are we at? What's the ground that we're standing on now, right? So I wanted to propose something a little bit differently about being in the world. That being in the world is not about globalization, and being in the world is also possibly not about whether it's a digital world or a physical world, but it's about effective attachments of the in between, right? That means the attachments I have with my friends, the attachments that I have with family, with with a site, and this sense of that these affective attachments could be in a virtual world, but it could also be in a very physical world. And this whole sense of being in the world, as I said, what is the world? What is worlding? What is this ing that we're putting to the world, right? And I wanted to these photographs which I'm using are actually from Brian. Brian's on the left there, and the Kusilja is an American New York dancer, and they are cooking together in the wilderness. So this sense of and he maintained all these. He took a lot of photographs. I've asked him for these photographs because he's not the official archivist. So the photographs reveal all these kinds of moments of affection that he had with different people, including here when they were cooking together, and he would, take them, or he'll position the camera in a certain way to capture this effect, this kind of emotion. Kind of like the Japanese have a term for it. We call it ma, which is the space in between or the time in between, which cannot be captured physically. So, coming to this traveling, one of the things that we did immediately when we arrived in Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, HCMC, was that many people visited the War Remnants Museum. And it is, of course, the museum of the Vietnam War, but it was called in 1975 as the House for Displaying War Crimes of American Imperialism. And the puppet government of South Vietnam. Later, it was called the Museum of American War Crimes, and then later it was called the War Crimes Museum. And now, in the age of diplomacy, it's called War Remnants Museum. Right, so it's gone through many different renames, but it's also the same kind of diplomacy shit that we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, the Russian war, because in a way, all politicians are too busy being diplomats, and I think that this is very clear. Like in 1975, it's like the House for Displaying War Crimes of American Imperialism and a Puppet Government. This kind of thing will never happen now in 2022. Right? You know, maybe only Zelensky is doing this kind of thing, but now it's called the War Remnants Museum. But we went there because it's a very important narrative of Vietnam of that time, and of course how something remains, because we realize in performance studies that performance doesn't disappear, but performance remains. The performance of war remains, and the performance of protests remains. From one culture to another culture, it's translating, right? Um, and during those 2 weeks, we met many different angles or different, I would say, human embodiments um, of the context of Vietnam. And we met, for example, Hoàng Hong, who's very much from the world of surveillance, constant censorship, political prisoner, perhaps. We can say that he was jailed for 39 months in 1982 for having poems of a fellow poet, and they were alleged to be counter-revolutionary culture objects. And so he went to jail for 39 months, and he edited, at that time he was editing this online Vietnamese journal called Talawas, banned in Vietnam, but you know, we can all get past the firewall in Vietnam. And Talawas stopped in 2010, but it also shows a kind of a different world, right? Because it's a world of surveillance and not just the world of the Vietnam War. And then we had a young journalist, Chin Thi Nguyen. She's the one with the camera. She's actually this year in Documenta. She's showing in Documenta this year. And at that time, she was making several documentaries and installations. And one of her first feature length was called Love Man, Love Woman. It's about transgender, tech-savvy shamans. And she follows them, and it's a very I think it's a fabulous film. It was her first feature, but it was great because it was very much about this crossing of sexuality, crossing of the real and shamanism, the real and spirits, and crossing of course. In 2007, technology with huge mobile phones and this kind of thing that they were working with, that they were getting calls in the middle of a shamanic ritual, and then they would turn from that. Well, it's also a world which is virtual into another virtual technology, gambling, taking bets, and all that, all on the phone, and so this sense of a kind of shamanism, which is very different from what we know, and then at the same time we have this. I took the words out about this idea of the returning diaspora. I think very much that the theater of Gorky for me is my interest in it, and my position with it is about the diasporic theater, and the diaspora also becomes it's not just post-migrant, but it is there. It is a reality of the city of Berlin. But this idea that because of the war in Vietnam, many people had to flee to France or to the US, and then they returned, right? So this idea of returning to a physical site, and I want to go back to this idea that the worlding is informed by our turning of attention to a certain experience, a certain place, a certain encounter, and our active engagement with the materiality that is material, and the context in which events and interactions occur is an embodied and enacted process, a way of being in the world consisting of an individual's whole person act of attending to the world in the city of Ho Chi Minh City. So we also met with a lot of these returning diaspora, and they were mostly in intercultural unions, French partners perhaps, and Vietnamese individuals, and they were the ones who were forming. There's a collective at that time called the Wonderful Atelier, and they did all these party going, creating parties, creating experimental spaces, experimental DJ, sound art, video artists, and it was both about this kind of transculturalism in life, because many of them were couples, and at the same time they were also experimenting with these spaces and these sounds and video a lot, and also kind of like spaces of gathering, right? Because one of the things we realized about the pandemic was that we could no longer gather. So this whole notion of what is in the politics of gathering, as we are now gathering, uh, unfortunately in a situation where I'm giving you information in this way, but that we are physically gathered in one space, yeah. Um, and this project of Wonderful Atelier, I wanted to introduce her because she's a very interesting artist who has since left Vietnam. She's Vietnamese, but kind of moved to France, to Bordeaux, and Sandrine Luque, and now she's actually in Lisbon. And it's a kind of a this whole project that she created there for perhaps a decade, maybe even more, is this melting pot of pop and kitsch and avant-garde all happening in one space. Um, but I want to turn the attention to not so much the art, that because there was no art making, but the process of translation that was happening. Because we had like the best translators, because they were all local university students, and they were very hardworking, they were conscientious, they were very bright, and they were the ones who were bringing us around the city. I mean, of course, that both the English and Vietnamese were very strong, but it's not a UN conference where you have simultaneous translations aiming for this perfect translation of a word to a word or a phrase to a phrase. But it was instead a kind of human process, again, of affect, right? That they were not neutral machines, but they were another layer, or another human layer, and that it was not about objective exchange of information, but a kind of um, an immersion inside the space, that the worlding that each of these translators were creating, like this in this situation where Aletta, now she's in California Institute of Art, she went on to study art and curation. At that time, she was just a university student in science, and you know, we're all forming these little kind of circulations of effective machineries, in a way, machineries. And and one of the ways that we strategized was in this kind of like almost like personal storytellings, right? So they worked with a group of 4 or 5 people, and they went around the town or the city, and the schedule was very open, and there were lots of bonding quietly and privately, like going out to eating at night markets, going to situations where they are photographing the city late at night. And these were like photographs from Brian, from his group of two translators that they were moving around with. Um, and we were not in a theater. We were in a gallery, Gallery Quinn, who's it's a gallery owned by a diasporic Vietnamese American, Quinn, who's now almost, I think that she's now been in Vietnam for 20 years. And we went there every day to be together. And this idea that we had to change this white box into a space where um, we could still be comfortable, but also not go outside. Because in that socialist environment of 2007, there were a lot of spies, and we were told actually there were lots of secret police, and so it's probably a narrative that some of you from the East Berlin, former East Berlin, is familiar with, that there was a lot of permits required, but also that we could not gather. Again, this whole thing about the politics of gathering, right? Which is one of the reasons why, in a time of the pandemic, China, countries like China and Singapore and various other countries which have an authoritarian leaning, is also using this pandemic to reduce the gathering, right? But it was very interesting because the interested locals came every day to be with us, right? So they were mostly visual arts students, they were young university people, and they wanted to connect with the outside world in a time when internet was available, but possibly quite expensive at that time. So that it was a way in which they could connect with us physically in one space 15 years ago. And again, there were 26 artists. This is Max Stewart, and she was talking very much about her experience there, and how it was, because as a curator, I just initiated the platform, and basically everyone made their own journeys in the space. And one of the things that, maybe just column two, that she was terrified of crossing the streets in Ho Chi Minh City, because there were no traffic lights, right? So all these motorbikes are just zipping across. And it was very much of a kind of like a metaphor for her moving out of her own safe zone to go into this zone of the other, that was terrifying for her. And I think that she was she was also very cynical of our presence in Vietnam, because there we are with all our MacBooks, and everyone's doing stuff, collecting sound, collecting this, collecting that. And I think but later she wrote this email where she talked about how, for her as an artist, because she was not making art, it became a kind of a different space. So I think that in this time of the pandemic, perhaps one question that is important for us, well, we're almost, perhaps we're at the end of the pandemic. We can't tell, right? But the sense of like, what does the space of the theater become? What does the space of the gallery become? What is the kind of art that we are rethinking of? What is the kind of human process or non-human process that we are engaged in? I just want to segue a little bit to some of the discussion about capital, that Iwa Ong, in her book, she's Malaysian, and she wrote a beautiful book about neoliberalism as exceptions. So she did a kind of Agamben version, but relating very much to neoliberalism and to economy, and about how mutations happen in citizenship and sovereignty. And she was very, very cautious about how she feels that neoliberal capital is full of disguises, right? That it's disguising itself over and over again. That it disguises itself as a government grant. It disguises itself as a process, but that actually, for example, an art laboratory is now making a new product, right? So you go to an art fair nowadays, and then it's all about processes. They're no longer selling art. Art is tucked away on the side or on the internet, but they are now some kind of, get to know, like some of you may have been to Art Berlin and Tempelhof, and then they are introducing Southeast Asia, or introducing Africa. So there's a whole sense of like, we're not selling art. We are having some kind of knowledge distribution. And so this sense that she brings in strongly about that, it's neoliberal capital is dynamic and fleet-footed, and very often it's linked to, of course, how the governments are creating grants and creating certain politics in the city. And I wanted to just kind of put ourselves under the spotlight, that we are in the market still. We're not outside of it because most of us have to survive. We might be getting a grant. We might be getting a fee. But this idea of the art market being sovereign, right? And that it's something where we have to survive, but there is a way in which these disguises are pulling us along. And this sense of the art market is, perhaps a very old book, but still a good read, called Empire 2000, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, where they characterize who is the sovereign or what is the sovereign, right? As a kind of a control that extends throughout the depths of consciousness and bodies of the population, at the same time across the entirety of societal relations. So as we are in the digital space, we are very much aware that the sovereign are the monopolies, right? There's a very strong flow of channeling of information, channeling of knowledge, and of certain distributions which come from these monopolies. So this whole idea of like, can we have a different art which perhaps it's about not so much about exploiting worlds, but about curiosity, about retaining agency, our agency, about decolonizing ourselves and coexisting critically with capital. I think it's not easy, but the question of constantly pondering this is part of, I would say, the work which I've been involved in for the last 3 years, and a kind of not wanting to just make the next production was very important for me to hold on to, and to really think through a process of working with young change makers and trying to connect various generations of change makers. So this idea that we need to look at a different value, right? And it links, of course, to the globalization, economy, interests of the male white philosophers. But I think that it goes beyond that. It goes into some other value, some of the values which Haraway talks about, some of the decolonial spaces, and the whole sense of like, what is value today? What should we be looking at as we go into the next decade of making work, thinking about work? And I see myself as an artist, as a artist curator, working more like an artistic ombudsman, right? That means I'm actually in a process of balancing, talking, perhaps not so different from a dramaturg in a theater, but in a sense of like to think about complexifying rather than simplifying the spaces. So it was a very unusual experience for these artists, right? Because they were wondering at this luxury of, because they were sent a ticket to go to Vietnam. They were sent a ticket to they were put up. There was an artist fee, and it was not easy for them to think about not giving back something, right? Because we all live in exchange economies, right? Of pursuing, consuming, bartering, exchanging one value for another. And we were very strict in the process about that. There were no works in progress. It was not a rehearsal space. It was not a mechanism to develop an ensemble, and that there was no making of any joint work. Just talking together, just being together, traveling together, thinking together. And it was unlike other kinds of arts residencies where you go into the city and you try to make work there, which is about responding to, let's say, the town square, or responding to the supermarket, or responding to the disco, or something like that. But this idea of not being encouraged to make art as the first impulse, but this idea of constantly just trying to be together and to be in these daily interactions. So this first half, I think I've gone over a lot of time, but the first half of this idea, just to put down in a way the roots for myself of my process with the YCA, which was to prioritize the process, the consciousness, the possibility of uncovering a different value, right? And then we fast forward to 15 years to today, 2022, but with a segue to last year where we had the digital YCA. And I wanted to, I'm going to take the video off now. I wanted to kind of bring us back to the fact that when we made the Young Curators Academy here, everything was digitized. It was an experiment to think about reaching out to people from across the world that we are not physically together, but we were immersed in something. And this site is called Young Curators Academy without any spaces, youngcuratorsacademy.com. Go onto it. Don't go onto it now because I need the internet, but go onto it in your own time. Maybe I'll put on the video later. But because why is it important? Because it's not just an archive of information of when is the show, what is the show, but it's actually an active archive, right? So that means that everything that was being publicized was also being uploaded almost immediately, a week or so, 10 days, and it's still an archive. So all the videos which I'm going to show you all today, I'm going to be a tour guide, and I'm going to go through some videos. They're all on the website, and I wanted to highlight a few of these videos because they are recurring themes which are going to be very much with us in the next 3 weeks. And it's related very much to certain themes or thematics which Gorky is working with, and also, of course, the YCA is working with. And I wanted to kind of connect them and to think about the YCA platform and also this space which I came from and the space of Gorky itself as an interweaving space, right? That means that you are like braids of hair of energy braiding together, and you are interweaving, and in that sense, the first video which I'm going to show is from Halia Hamedani. She's Iranian, and she was from the 2019 alumni. She was here in the 2019 showing her work in the container. The container, I think we began the container. I'm not sure. We were there. The Herb Salon was there for the container, and that was when the container started. And now in this Herb Salon, we are in the return of the studio. So Halia was involved in this work with 8 Iranian diaspora women who are all connected together. And of course, they're connecting digitally. But what is very interesting is that it goes back to the concept of care. And now in the open call of 2021, the open call talked about care, right? Care and repair as one of the themes of the DYCA of 21. And the care and repair was talking about how care is not just a private word, but care is about destroying the world that has existed and making a new world. And that care is about destroying an uninhabitable world, a brutal world, and to create a new world. Right? This is Saidiya Hartman. She's a wonderful writer, African American writer, and she talks about this quote which we lifted up, and we use that as one of our kind of main quotations in the open call. That care is not private, but care is about destroying the world as we have known it, and going into a new world together. Collaborating to create a new world together. And I'm going to show this part of the video where she's talking about how this group of women, Kafta, are actually having to destroy the old world, which is full of patriarchy and cyberbullying, right? Okay, let me see what I. Mm, here. Okay.
The word kaftar means hyena in Persian. Kaftar is a group of 8 women artists and curators from Iran based in different cities around the world. Kaftars are based in Tehran, London, Rome, Helsinki, Toronto, and New York. Kaftar came together last autumn in October 2020 during the protests of Iranian women against the male aggression, harassment, bullying, and patriarchy, especially in and around Iran's art scene. A hyena, passing by the deserts around Tehran, noticed that men were using her name as an insult to silence women. So the hyena decided to find her comrades and enter the city to tell their own story. Hello, everyone. I am Helia. I am the Kaftar member who lives between Rome and Tehran. I'm a contemporary art historian and an independent curator. And this is a story about Kaftar with words and images of the 8 founders of the collective that I am re articulating and narrating from my point of view. Hyenas have a terrible reputation in many cultures, in Persian or Farsi, for example. In some contexts, the word kaftar is associated with witches or an ugly old woman. Our story begins when a group of women artists challenged a social media account in Iran for its harassments and cyberbullying. In response, the account said, "Shut up, hyenas," as an insult toward the women accusing him. Though the word kaftar is often used to make derogatory remarks against women, we embrace the word as a metaphor.
So they embrace the word.
In Persian literature, like in many other cultures, animal metaphors have been a powerful way to criticize cruelty of the dominant power. So we started researching the nature of kaftars, their behavior, and myth around them. Kaftar is a nocturnal animal, often living in large female dominated social groups. They are also known as the cleanup crew in the nature. They are a specialized type of carnivores called scavengers, as they often eat leftovers of other predators. Hyenas are a necessary part of the ecosystem. They can digest any kind of organic matter that help break down cadavers and prevent the spread of diseases.
Okay. So I'm using my phone because all the timings are here, so I can see them. And please excuse me because I don't have a piece of paper. Um, but so this video is inside the archive, and Helia was speaking in the first 2 days, where it was called the New Old World after the pandemic, the New Old Internationalism, the New Old World post-pandemic, and you could see that it's one of the recurrent themes of intersectional feminism in the Herb Salon, right? Women who are taking on these issues which are still alive, of course, they're very alive, patriarchal bullying, and how they embrace the ugly, the witch term, right? Which is so it's a kind of a strategy that has gone through time, and this idea of Saidiya Hartman's, where it's about you have to destroy the old world and create a new one, and their journey you can go onto this. This is only a 3-minute clip. Most of the videos are about 15 minutes, so it's not very long, and I think that it's great to spend a rainy day on the videos there. Okay, I'm going to now stop this and show you another video. And I want to come back to a theme which actually emerged so strongly this year because disability really became uh, a big subject. And I'll tell you something that was quite funny because we were actually totally unprepared for it. What we had done in the open call was that we had said that we are creating an accessible site and with an archive, etc., and many disabled participants applied, and it became quite a learning curve for us because we suddenly realized that how do we create a kind of a digital architecture which would be embracing to disability, and we were not really prepared, and we went through this learning curve because usually when you are working with disability, it's already you are inside the building. The architect has designed the building. Well, we had to design this whole digital site, so it was a kind of uh, a big learning curve. And what was interesting about this process was that from the 170 applicants, we laterally transferred a lot of people to become our experts. So like we had individuals who were applying with so much digital knowledge about digital labor, about digital precarity, and it was like, oh my God, you can teach me, you can teach us. And so they were applying to participate, but we translated and transferred them across to become our expert speaker, let's say. So it was a very interesting process that in the developing of criteria of selections, we found that it was getting more and more and more scientific, and this whole sense of like how you begin a project where um, you talk about accessibility and then it becomes a disability arena, and actually we had so much to learn, and we had then many people who came in to be our guides through the disability process. And I want to show a video of, again, the alumni of 2019. I'm not presenting anyone from 2021, 22, because you're going to meet them, right? You're going to meet them over the next few weeks. So I'm presenting mostly the alumni. And in 2019, we had Olivier Kim, who uh, introduced and talked about the sick woman theory. And Olivier is Korean, but based in Berlin. And I'll start the video here.
We fast forward to 2014. The Black Lives Matter movement is at its height, and artist Johanna Hetva is lying sick in their bed in Los Angeles. They're chronically ill and witness the political actions happening outside of their window. Hetva, unable to attend physically, is asking the question, how do you throw a brick through the window of a bank if you can't get out of bed? And with this, they formulate the beginning of the essay Sick Woman Theory. Here they criticize Hannah Arendt's notion of the political, which is a political always in need of a public. They understand why Arendt wanted to emphasize political action done in public, but point out that everything done in private is also political. How long you take a shower, actually how long you can afford to take a shower, with whom you have sex with, whether or not you write an email with racist slurs inside. Hetva points out how protests lack accessibility and that the people most vulnerable to those issues which are being protested cannot be there due to police violence, sickness, no access, no accessibility, etc. Further, they criticize the binary between sickness and wellness. Capitalism makes us believe that sickness is, or can be, or should be only temporary. Wellness or being well is conceived as a default mode. Being sick is existing only as an exception. However, being chronically ill means that there is not an option of being healed. Hedva regards the body and mind in sick woman theory as sensitive and reactive to regimes of oppression, aka neoliberal, white supremacist, imperial capitalist, cis heteropatriarchal regimes. It is not the fault of the sick, but more a result of historical trauma that the world itself is making and keeping us sick. And I quote them here. The most anti-capitalist protest is to care for another and to care for yourself, to take on the historically feminized and therefore invisible practice of nursing, nurturing, caring, to take seriously each other's vulnerability and fragility and precarity, and to support it, honor it, empower it, to protect each other, to enact care.
Okay. I think there's a cat in her video, right? Not a cat out here, right? Yeah, but okay. Anyway, so this is Olivia had just become a mother, and she was really talking about this care and motherhood, and as she says that it's taking a shower. You have to plan your time to take a shower, right? And I think that the next video is it's again on this topic of care because care and repair is so broad, right? So well, I wanted to bring in this topic of how do we care for the dead, and for those of you who know Arkady Zaides's work, he has been very involved in finding the graves of missing persons, of people who have died, crossing across getting into the fortress of the EU, but as a dead body, right? That means they died, and because maybe at sea, or they possibly were shot, or I don't. There were multiple reasons, and he's been locating the graves, and this is his project Necropolis, which is in association with a network called United Network, which some of you are very familiar with because it has been in certain projects here, but the new part of his work is how to have a virtual memorial for the people, like the loved ones of the families who were waiting for their sons or daughters or fathers or mothers to come back, but they never came back, and in a way they don't even know where their bodies are. So this idea of having a virtual memorial for mourning, for grieving, for dignity, for repair, and I think it would be good to show his video. I think he explains it better than me. Here we are.
Our project also refines the initial database of the United Network. Often when searching for localization or localizing the graves, we find inaccuracies in the list. A name that is missing in the list, a country of origin that was not indicated, a wrong age. Now there are entries to the list that our project helped clarify. To be precise, at the moment there are 72 entries to the list of deaths that the Necropolis team either added or updated. And numerous victims that were previously mentioned on the list, I don't know if you could see it before, as NN, which stands for nomen nessio, that means in Latin, I don't know the name, was given their name back. And now I will walk with you through a bit of the process of the new process, or the next step of the process that we started last year, actually with the outbreak of COVID. And this is a project which is resulting from all this investigation with a new form or a new space that we wish to inhabit, which is the virtual space. And this perhaps also more precisely, I mean, it's interesting that I'm presenting it now in the digital agora. And this is also a place where I would like us to discuss about it. So social network profiles already outlive their creators, and eulogy over recently deceased family members shared online. The virtual space is increasingly containing not only information about our lives, but also about our deaths. More recently, since the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, due to the restriction on mobility and gathering, the virtual space increasingly became a place where burial ceremonies, often of the victims that lost their lives to the virus, could take place. As the Necropolis project continues and more graves are localized, we feel that this information cannot be only exposed to the audience in the theater. We feel an ethical responsibility to make this information accessible to others, and specifically to the community that is directly affected by this situation. Relatives of most of the deceased migrants might never be able to arrive in Europe and visit the graves of their loved ones and to have a proper process of mourning. And this is a gap which the project would like to fill. So the Necropolis Virtual Memorial Project aims at building an independent information system constructed on the data that we obtained and continuously gathering through our performances, through the research that we conduct in all the places. And the objective of the project is to design a platform that accumulates that data and at the same time allows for a process of mourning and remembrance. This new data platform is the result of a meeting between the United Network and its list of deaths, the project Necropolis, and more recently a larger consortium of universities, including École Urbaine de Lyon, the University of Ghent.
Yeah. I left the closed caption on. Do you all prefer it off? Is it distracting, or do you like to have the closed caption? It's okay. So, okay, wait, it's here. um, so you can see like as you go through a lot of these projects, they are not necessarily on first look curatorial projects, right? Because they are very much artist-led, writer-led, perhaps more NGO-like. But I think that what is very interesting is that, as I said, it's an expanded curation that we are involved in Herb Salon and involved in the Young Curators Academy, a sense of a kind of activation of certain necessary actions in communities, right? That these actions have not been activated so far. I will now have two more short videos, and one of them is, yes, it's related very much to this work of Sukaina Abulaulas from Marrakesh. It's related very much to this idea of unmuting archives, that some archives have been muted and some voices have been silenced. And I think that it's interesting that in this same 3 weeks, you have Tara. Tara's project is also about voices, and in particular about Saudi Arabian songs, which is sung in private spaces. So let's listen a little bit to Sukaina, but this sense that she discovers that these storytellers, singing storytellers, shikas, are actually uh, more than just entertainment, and she links it to the resistances that is happening in contemporary art as well, especially in contemporary art journals. She mentions two in particular, Souffle and Fez. So, and she rediscovers this particular singer narrator, the Shika, and she rediscovers the earliest known woman who is singing in this way, and and looks at it as a kind of a pathway of resistance and also a kind of a solidarity, and drawing these lines, these kind of lines of flight and lines of alliances and affinities together.
I thought Kharbusha was entertaining. It turned out she was performing rage, resistance, and a profound desire for liberation. Today, as I re-encounter Kharbusha, I realize that her image and the image of the Shikha character, or what the Shikha represents in general, was distorted by fear of what it embodies: resistance, oral poetry, and commitment to political struggles. In looking back on Kharbusha's words, I find many similarities between her laments and the questions posed by the generations that followed. For instance, Soufl and Fes, which cover I mentioned to you earlier, was an important example of the continuity to the opposition to authoritarian regimes in the formerly colonized world. The contributions in Soufl ranged from Moroccan poetry to open letters and debates, conversations between artists and intellectuals. Many of the poems published back then in the first issues were invested in provoking the readers and upsetting the political and aesthetic statu quo. One can even dare to say that those contributions were in the same spirit and alignment of the literary violence and roughness initiated by Kharbusha. The generations that followed continued reconstructing the memory of resistance and expressing the elders' agonies in different ways. But one must really consider that this continuity didn't progress naturally. The new generations had to fight to revive the work of their predecessors, as between one generation and the other, a gap always occurred. And as one resistance emerges, instead of it being transmitted to the following generation, it gets muted and lost somewhere. In an ideal world, Kharbusha's words would have been transcribed. Her performance and oral poetry would have been included in the Moroccan art discourse, and she would have been recognized as a Moroccan woman, female artist. Instead, it's been used as an entertainment material until it lost its legitimacy. It was only years later that this legitimacy was revived in its real context by Moroccan artists who are activating these past stories and situating them in their contemporary narratives.
Okay, maybe
And here, I would like to give the example.
I don't think we have time to listen, right, to a song. So, yeah, let's go on. So the last video is it's this rich archive is all there in the website, but the last video is related to a topic which I think is quite important. It's an artist called Nora Al Badri, and she was one of our speakers for the Digital Agora, and she spoke about decoloniality and the digital space, right? And in particular, there's this part where she directly addresses the museums who are holding a lot of artifacts and not allowing for any kind of not just reparation, but that these artifacts cannot even be digitized. And of course, because the digitalization. So one of the projects that Nora Al Badri did was to hack the bust of Nefertiti so that she could bring this material onto the digital space, and it was quite a well-known work, maybe 5-7 years ago, where it's about returning this work to returning this artifact to Egypt, because it's not going to be physically returned, but it can be digitally returned, and it can be a process of decolonizing these museums, concepts of collections. So, so let me just put on her direct letter. Yes, to the museums.
Dear museums and colonial nations of the global north, your data is haunting you. Demons are waiting for you in latent space, ready to attack at any vector and any time. Digitization has engendered a notion that certain museums may become Datenkraken, like data octopuses, hoarding data sets relating to the holdings whose physical monopoly they already possess. So this practice leads to moments like this one where I'm compelled to mention the British Museum when I digitally publish or remix an artifact from Iraq, such as the 3D data set of the beautiful Lamasu, which you see in a moment. Maybe you can tell where this is heading. I mean, yeah, let me put it straight to you. We live in a post-digital world as much as a post-colonial one. And in the end, the important debate is not about what kinds of licenses should be granted, but about who owns cultural data and who controls it, and perhaps to whom it's attributed. So when I say that, that's the Lamasu, when I say that imperial museums are haunted by data, I'm not referring to any abstract ghosts, but suggesting that you abolish yourselves, museums. Frankly, as long as your collections are not updated, you might as well be ghosted by your conscious audience. There are so many self-appointed universal or world museums around, but these are really, in my opinion, at best nationalist spaces, and at worst they are fascist ones. There is nothing universal in the state, in the sense of stateless or global or even cosmopolitan, involved in what you are up to. But data can be stateless. I think we, the people, should build digital world museums that live up to the name. Citizens of the world cannot yet overcome national citizenship, but I wonder whether data can be our avant-garde in that struggle. After all, data exists in territories that range from the somewhat uncontrollable to the outright unregulated and anarchic. And you can tell I'm a fan of that. Imperial museums are becoming vulnerable to hacks by decolonial minds. Datasets cannot be contained. Once online or on a public domain, you can add any copyright license, but it means nothing. So the virality and the afterlife of cultural data has a real beauty and power. I like to call it, in the words of Sonia Katyal, techno-heritage. But stateless techno-heritage does not mean random data without a context, or even without representation through classification or things like that. On the contrary, I think today we know that data without context is at best worthless and at worst harmful. So I think the conversation gets quite upsetting when museums use copyrights to restrict the distribution of knowledge and remixes derived from their physical and virtual holdings. But yeah, how can a 1,000-year-old artwork have a copyright anyway? But museums offer many arguments when trying to prohibit reuse in the public domain. They want to prevent commercialization, except in their gift shops, of course, or even to protect someone or something from bad taste of us peasant people and our shameless remixing. And I'm not joking here. That's quotes from museums. In short, I think museum practices in the global north seem highly anachronistic, and the suggested democratic potential of technology stands in sharp contrast with the widespread institutional angst about their declining relevance and their threatened status as gatekeepers of a legitimate interpretation, Deutungshoheit, and representation. And I think museums, you are right to be afraid. Yeah, you better be afraid, I think. Because the digital is no slave to the original. And believe it or not, many people do not even require the real thing anymore. In the same breath, one needs to respect, and I mean respect, the fact that not all cultural data wants to be free and dispersed. This is crucial, because data sets will only dance with you once you acknowledge, see, know, or truthfully relate to them. And as a matter of fact, in very different cultures on different continents, a data set or a 3D printed object can hold the same power and enable the same connection as the original material item. So this is the reason why some people think that certain objects should neither be exhibited and touched by custodians, nor digitized and their copies exhibited. These people view cultural data not just according to its inherent technological potential, as Western media theory so often does, but as something that is constantly being translated and given meaning by local versions of world-making, cosmologies, and ancestral knowledge.
I think we could stop here. So Nora Al-Badri's work, it goes back to that very first slide, right, about worlding, and worlding is being immersed in this world, in this encounter where it's a whole person's involvement. That even though she's in the digital world, it's an entire politic of how she feels that information access needs to be opened up and the creative channels opened up rather than hoarded. I think it's on that very provocative note. Perhaps I stop my lecture here. All these wonderful people, you can find them on the archive of the Young Curators Academy. Do you need to see? Oh, sorry, my machine is not as sophisticated as I imagined, but okay, can let's see a website uh, of Young Curators Academy. Sorry, yeah, okay, here we are. Okay, you see the building itself, um, yeah, and it's concluded. Visit the archive, so you go into archive, and then you have these 7 days. Should I put it on the bigger? Sorry, into the screen. Yeah, and you can see like everything. Like for example, the super intense a marathon where all the 17 young curators in 2021, you have them all. Like for example, we had Beer making their presentation from Melbourne, and you can just click onto it, and then it brings you to their video, a 15-minute presentation of their work there. And so it's a kind of a way of trying to archive, which is very active, and it's not really just a website, but it's already ongoing as a full archive. In the archive, you would have the digital agora, where there are a lot of different speakers, and then the alumni more in the new old world in 10 acts. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have questions? I mean, there's a microphone somewhere around. I mean, if anyone wants to have a question, yeah, or a couple of questions, yeah. But if not, we can also have a drink. Anyone wants to have a question? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the program and for bringing all this really exciting people here.
Thank you very much for having all of them, having me. Yeah, thank you.